Malacharja, Rinrushla, Forcherui, Gnokite Shaw, and Hegokite, Satra, Samhain agus Science Conglinne Shaw. So welcome everyone to the first event in our Samhain agus Science program for 2022. Now I'm required to give you some essential practical information before we start. Firstly, in the event of fire, please proceed down the stairs that you came up and out of the front door, and then cross the road to the other side, to the large lit up building you see there. Secondly, male and female toilets can be found on the ground floor and non-binary toilets on the fourth floor. And now then to the event. Samhain agus Science is our annual mini festival, inspired loosely by the time of Halloween. It's now the 5th year that we've held Samhain agus Science, and the festival brings together researchers from each of our disciplines. So that's Celtic studies, theoretical physics, and cosmic physics, for a series of free events to mark the feast of Samhain. Now, Samhain agus Science runs this year until the 7th of November, and for details of our other events in the program, you can check out the website that I've listed on the blackboard here, although it might be easy just to Google Samhain agus Science 2022, and that will come up as I've checked. Okay, now to tonight's talk. We are very pleased to introduce our guest speaker. Professor Joseph Nagy is the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Irish Studies at Harvard University in the United States of America. Over a long and distinguished career, Professor Nagy has made a formidable contribution to the study of early Irish literature. A graduate of Harvard, Professor Nagy spent the greater part of his career on the other coast of America at the University of California, Los Angeles, before returning to Harvard in 2016. He is the author of numerous monographs and articles. His books, The Wisdom of the Outlaw, The Boyhood Deeds of Finn in Gaelic narrative tradition, and Conversing with Angels and Ancients, Literary Myths of Medieval Ireland. These are required reading for anyone who wants to understand the nature of early Irish narrative literature. I won't go through his articles, as it would take us the entire allotted time that we have tonight, but I will simply mention that in 2021 alone, he published 4 essays on topics ranging from how time flies in the Cath Mag Tuired to a prophylactic pig, a long-lost hunter, and the recording of oral tradition. Professor Nagy also has a record of service to the discipline as founder and first co-editor of the Celtic Studies Yearbook of North America and a former president of the Celtic Studies Association of North America. He currently serves on the governing board of the School of Celtic Studies here. And tonight, Professor Nagy will talk about food and fantasy in medieval Irish tradition, so please give him a warm welcome.
Right. Thank you so much, Barry, for that far too generous introduction. I'm very honored to be here. Is this bulletproof, by the way? You see here my email address, and please feel free to email me if you'd like to have more information about anything that I will be informally discussing tonight, or if you'd like to have a copy of the PowerPoint, or perhaps even some of the publications I'll be citing here. I'd be delighted to hear from you. So don't hesitate to contact me if you like. It's certainly a privilege to be here participating in what has proven to be an important forum for showing off all that the Institute and the fields it represents are offering to all of us in the modern world, as well as to scholarly posterity, not just at Samhain, but throughout the year. This presentation will be timely, as I hope to show. Samhain and the fall in general are very much marked by food and foodways appropriate to the season, but we'll also introduce a relatively new and fast-growing field of knowledge that combines the sciences, humanities, the social sciences, and other disciplines in a very exciting transdisciplinary fashion. I'm referring to what is generally called food studies, an area of study that at my current university, Harvard, is still scattered among various disciplines and schools, but that at my previous university, the University of California, Los Angeles, I'm proud to say, is now an organized program bringing together students and faculty from a variety of departments and divisions, including the medical school, public health, the law school, and of course, social sciences, humanities, and STEM sciences. Food studies at UCLA now features undergraduate and graduate level courses, and thanks to generous donors, has launched a well-funded research center. So this is something quite exciting, I think. Harvard has some catch up to do with that, but I think it probably will get around to this as well. I can say from personal experience that participating in the foundation of this food studies program in Los Angeles gave me the opportunity to meet with more scholars from more fields and with a wider array of the public from beyond the university than any other venture in which I was honored to be included in my academic career so far. My primary areas of interest remain, of course, medieval Irish literature and comparative folklore and mythology. But I hope that what I have to say will show that as fantastic as food can be in the traditional and literary imagination, the scientific core of knowledge needed to understand the getting, use, and distribution or disposal of food, a knowledge the cultivation of which we share with our ancestors, is never lost sight of, either by scholars of food studies or by the countless generations of consumers whose foodways we explore. Now, just to add to my embarrassment and having been so wonderfully introduced, I should point out that we have here in the audience people who actually should be giving this talk. Among them is Professor Patricia Lysett, who was very much a trailblazing pioneer in the study of food studies, in the study of food and foodways in the Irish context and beyond the Irish context. And Patricia, I'm deeply embarrassed as well as honored by your presence. We also have here in our midst Dr. Liam Downey, who has written some work that I'm actually going to cite. Yeah, I'm sure there are many other people here in this room also who have contributed or have much to contribute to this fascinating field. So let's see. Let's go on. That's not my dog, by the way. So, right. So just to be a hopeless academic and to give some bibliography here, some items to mention here. Again, Patricia Lysett, it actually is a name to conjure with, especially when it comes to fascinating later developments in food in Irish tradition. But a work that just has to be mentioned because it really was so groundbreaking was the article by Anthony T. Lucas, Irish Food Before the Potato, which Barry, you'll be amused to see, was published in a Welsh folklore journal, Gwerin, in 1960, and which very much was the go-to place for any consideration of what the records, literary records, but also archaeological records tell us about food in the pre-modern period in Ireland and what people were eating and how they were preparing what they were eating. There's a very useful article by Dr. Downey, co-authored with his Dutch colleague there, Stuits, which is an overview of Lucas's survey. And this was published in the Journal of Irish Archaeology, as you see, in 2013. And I would leave it to Dr. Downey, perhaps in questions or comments afterwards to add to this, but I would say that the major revision proposed in that article to what Lucas says has to do with meat. It has to do with what meat people were eating in Ireland in the Middle Ages. and even beyond. And apparently the archaeological record would suggest that there was a lot more beef being eaten than what Lucas proposed. Lucas proposed that essentially pork was the food of choice, because of course, why would you want to eat your cattle since they're producing food? But in fact, the archaeological evidence would suggest that there was more eating of beef, and there were more bones to be found in various trash heaps than we might think. But anyway, it's a very, very useful and helpful article. I suppose, and I'm not just saying this because I'm at the Institute, but perhaps now the truly go-to place for a survey of medieval Irish eating and what was being eaten is a book by a professor emeritus here in the School of Celtic Studies at the Institute, Professor Fergus Kelly, his Early Irish Farming, which, as those of you who have used this remarkable resource know, goes far beyond just farming, and also talks about life and times in medieval Ireland, based primarily on legal texts, but also taking other kinds of sources of information into account. A remarkable study, and if you don't have a copy, I really recommend that you get one, because it's great. We almost should be selling copies of it here after the talk. Another very valuable collection now of essays was put together by Galway's Elizabeth Fitzpatrick and James Kelly, titled Food and Drink in Ireland, which really covers the whole span from prehistoric to early modern or even modern, and lots of articles about important subjects such as what did everyday people eat, because of course so much of the literary record is focused on the higher classes, and what can we tell about what people who were not necessarily in those higher classes, what they were eating in pre-modern Ireland. So a very, very useful piece of work. Now, as I said, this was going to be timely. And the way it's going to be timely is I want to talk a little bit about fascinating Irish traditions, which are not limited to Ireland. So this seems to be something you can find across the span of North Atlantic cultures and even on the continent. Traditions having to do with Martinmas, or with St. Martin's Day, which is November 11. Would point out that in the switch of calendars from in the early modern period, that in fact November 11 would have originally been quite close to the 1st of November. And so Sean O'Sullivan, the great Irish folklorist, in this article about the Feast of St. Martin in Ireland, suggests that perhaps some of these traditions associated with Martin were originally associated with Samhain, and perhaps not even with St. Martin himself. Now, as you know, in the Christian tradition, a saint's feast day is supposedly the day on which the saint died. So here we have a picture of St. Martin's death. I know we have the rather sinister looking demon. They're off to the side on the left, but accounts of St. Martin's death, and St. Martin, a late antique saint, abbot and bishop, associated with the city of Tours. St. Martin's death was not something really quite spectacular, or at least not as spectacular as what it is sometimes made out to be in Irish folk tradition, as recorded by the Irish Folklore Commission, and as surveyed by Sean O'Sullivan in this wonderful article. In this case, I actually mentioned the place of publication because I was born in Bloomington, Indiana, which actually is a very important place for the Indiana University, and also for the study of folklore, because that still has a surviving doctoral program in folklore mythology, though at the time I was born, I was completely unaware of that. But anyway, in this article, O'Sullivan talks about legends having to do with the death of St. Martin. And these legends are not at all related to the early hagiographic tradition having to do with the life of Martin, which, by the way, was quite popular and quite influential in Irish hagiography and in the composition of Irish saints' lives. But in folk tradition, Saint Martin was not an abbot or a bishop. He was a miller, at least according to some tellings of his story. He was a miller, and he was a Christian, and because he was a Christian and because he was a miller, the wicked pagans who killed him actually milled him. They put him through the mill. And so we have this notion of Martin having died a violent martyr's death. And we also have the fascinating tradition that if you do not kill one of your animals before the eve of St. Martin's Day, you run the risk of having one of your favorite animals die, or perhaps even one of your children. So it's very important to kill something, to kill an animal in honor of St. Martin. And we even have some references to animal sacrifices to Martin from medieval tradition, but this is something primarily that comes up in folklore as collected in the 20th century from the Gaeltacht by the collectors for the commission. So, it sort of makes sense for November, whether just for the early part of November or throughout November, given that winter is approaching, to cull your herd, or even if you don't have a herd, which of course many would not have had, but at least to check on the animals that you do have living around or in the homestead, and to see which one is the least likely to make it through the winter, given the reduced food resources and so on. Plus, the killing of an animal could lead to perhaps some meat to be salted, to be dried, and used by the family during winter time and during the privations of winter. So there is good husbandry reasons for killing an animal around this time of year, and it comes to be associated with the figure of Saint Martin. There is a story about Martin which O'Sullivan gives here, which actually can also be found variants of in Douglas Hyde's Legends of Saints and Sinners. A story according to which it's not that Martin was a miller, but Martin came to a mill, and the miller was not willing to give him very much flour, but Martin somehow had him do it. And to reward the miller, Martin said to him, and I know this sounds very odd, but you can take a look at the article. Martin said to him, you know, if you, O miller, were to cut off some pieces of your extraneous fat, your blubber, and put those pieces under a dish, you will be pleasantly surprised in a day or so. So the miller is intrigued, and so he engages in some cutting of his body and puts some pieces of himself under a dish. And this is noticed by his maidservant. And she thinks this is interesting and suspects that the miller, as millers are wont, is doing this for his own benefit. So she thought she would imitate. And so she took some of the pieces from under the plate and put it on a separate plate and covered it. So the next day, what should happen? But the maidservant takes a look at what's under the dish, and mice or rats run out from what she had stored, from what she had put aside. The miller sees these creatures, who of course are competitors for food with us humans, and is quite shocked, but he happens to look at his own dish, which has been covered, and opens it, and out pops a cat. And of course, the cat starts to chase the mouse or the mice or the rats. So there is a kind of balancing out there. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that in this development of a tradition about Martin, there is this focus on food, and also a focus not just on food, but also on animals with whom humans engage in competition for the same food supplies. But also a reference to a domesticated animal, the cat, which of course can aid in the human race for food and the human attempt to keep the food supply coming and not eaten by anyone else. There's also much more about the figure of Saint Martin in English and also in Scandinavian tradition, written by a folklorist appropriately named Martin Walsh, which you can find in the journal Folklore and in some other places. Needless to say, there's much more one could say about Samhain and about food customs having to do with the eve of November 1st. For me, as someone who has worked on stories having to do with Finn McCool, there is that fascinating episode in his boyhood deeds, in his Macnivratha, where he is skulking around a she, an otherworldly dwelling around Samhain, and there is an exchange of food going on between one she and another. And in fact, what they are exchanging is roasted pig and probably garlic, wild garlic. So, but I will go on to other things. Now, a text which I'm sure is very familiar to some of you and perhaps known to all of us, but it's one that's always worth coming back to, is the story of Dathó's pig. This is coming to us from early Irish literary tradition. And the story, not that I'm going to tell the whole story, but just to remind you, this is the story about a contest between the warriors of Ulster and the warriors of Connaught, which starts out as a contest over who will possess the wondrous dog of Mac Dathó, who is a king and a host in Leinster. And Mac Dathó has made the possibly foolish, possibly wise decision to say yes to both camps, that yes, Ulster reps, you may have the dog, and also says to the Connaught representatives, well, no, you may have the dog too. So he just essentially, along with his wife's advice, he decides to let them figure it out or let them fight over it. But the fascinating thing about the story is that the quest for the dog is waylaid in this event, which, by the way, some of our sources say took place at Samhain. So there is something timely here too, perhaps. In fact, the contention ended up being about the dog, but primarily about this pig that Mac Dathó offers to the two assembled enemies of each other in his hostel. And it's a gigantic pig. It's a pig that's been around for long enough to be quite huge. There is, for those of you who might know this story from the translation of it into English by Geoffrey Gance in the Penguin Classic Early Irish Myths and Sagas, there is a line which for some reason Gance leaves out, and I have no idea why he does this, because it is there in the manuscript witnesses, and there's no reason to take it out unless, I don't know, you're trying to you're very concerned about what public health might be affected here. And I have it here for you, both the Irish and also in translation. On poison, however, Mac Dathó's pig had been nourished, so the massacre of the men of Ireland took place through it. So there's the sense of, in offering this pig, Mac Dathó knew what he was doing, and he was offering a pig that in fact already had some kind of literal or metaphorical poisonous aspect to it, which would lead to the truly chaotic and very, very violent outcome that happens in the story. I won't tell you more. If you need to have your memory refreshed about it, I urge you to take a look at it. It also is worth pointing out that there is a prequel there is a backstory to this pig, which I find fascinating. Namely, either Dathó's son or perhaps his grandson had been in charge of this pig. So he was the swineherd who was taking care of this pig. And he had grown very fond of this pig. So when the word came from his father and mother, or from his grandparents, to deliver the pig, because Dathó had these plans to use it for this particular banquet, the son was reluctant to give up the pig. So in fact, he elopes with the pig and runs off with it. He goes off far enough away to become exhausted. And so he decides to take a nap. And while he's taking a nap, the pig starts to root in the ground and digs so furiously that it in fact covers the body of the swineherd, and he suffocates to death. But the swineherd has his revenge in death, as it were, because he does die, but his sword or sharp implement is still sticking out from the ground. And as the pig is rooting about, it accidentally impales itself on the sword. And that's when Dathó's messenger comes and finds the pig. So I love the idea of Dathó's pig as featured in the feast in the actual tale itself, as opposed to this prequel. But I love the idea of the pig as featured in the feast as being in fact kind of roadkill, that it's something which has already been killed and is now being put to a special use. Now on to another text, which again is sort of Middle Irish literature with vestiges of old in it, the Battle of Mag Tuired, which has actually already been mentioned. This is a story that has to do with much more ancient times than those of Dathó's pig and the Ulster and Connaught warriors featured in that story. This has to do, in fact, with the Tuatha Dé Danann and with their coming to Ireland and with their struggle with the Fovoira, with these invaders from across the sea, who may or may not be comparable to the Vikings in the mind of the composer of this particular text. Now, among the Tuatha Dé Danann is the figure of the Dagda, whose name means the good God. And at least one of the explanations given for why he's the good God is because he can do everything that the other magically empowered members of the Tuatha Dé Danann are able to do. Lug, who is in charge of the Tuatha Dé Danann preparations for the Battle of Mag Tuired to come, sends the Dagda to spy on the Fovoira at their camp. So they've already landed and they're preparing for this monumental epic fight with the Tuatha Dé Danann. And this is happening a week before Samhain, according to the text. And here I quote from Gray's translation. The Fovoira made porridge, the word there is litiu, which later becomes ledia, for him to mock him, because his, the Dagda's, love of porridge was great. They filled for him the king's cauldron, which was 5 fists deep, and poured 80 gallons of new milk and the same quantity of meal and fat into it. They put goats and sheep and swine into it and boiled them all together with the porridge. I can't help but think of a dish that is very, very popular in the Chinese world, and including the Chinese diaspora, which is sometimes referred to on menus for Chinese restaurants as juk or as congee, which is essentially cooked rice, which then is boiled so that it almost disintegrates, and then you can throw in anything that you have. I mean, you can make juk as varied as you like, depending on what you throw into it. So here we're doing that with porridge, with something which is made up of grain, oats or possibly wheat, possibly even barley, and milk. But you can also throw in meat, for example. Well, it's being prepared in the king's cauldron, but then, as you see in the next section of this passage, then they poured it into a hole in the ground. And Invek, who is the king of the Fovoira, said to the Dagda that he would be killed unless he, the Dagda, consumed it all. He should eat his fill so that he might not revile the Fovoira. Then the Dagda took his ladle, and it was big enough for a man and a woman to lie in the middle of it. These are the bits that were in it, in the porridge or on the ladle, which he dips into the porridge. Halves of salted swine and a quarter of lard. I'm leaving out some bit here. And then the Dagda fell asleep then after eating his porridge. His belly was as big as a house cauldron, and the Fovoira laughed at it. Now, if this were a classroom situation and I were asking students to comment on this, I would ask them, what image is being repeated here in this particular passage? And they, I hope, would say, as I'm sure you all would say, the cauldron. That this is food that starts in the king's cauldron. And of course, the king's cauldron, like that beautiful sample of an Irish cauldron that I have on the title page of this PowerPoint, the cauldron is very much of a status symbol. It's very much a symbol of the king's power and the king's ability to prepare food and to distribute it among his subjects or among his guests. But then the cauldron's contents are poured into a hole in the ground. That is very much of a transition from, shall we say, culture into nature. And now it becomes something which you have to lap up almost in animal fashion, though the Dagda does have a ladle from the ground. It almost becomes a kind of fulucht situation, a cooking pit kind of situation. So this food is transportable, translatable, fungible, as it were, from being in a king's cauldron to being something that is just in the ground and waiting for the Dagda to eat it. And the Dagda, of course, does succeed in eating it, but as a result, he has a belly that now is as big as a house cauldron. So here we are with a cauldron again, but now instead of it being a cauldron in a king's dwelling, now it is a cauldron within the body itself. And of course, as some here have wonderfully explained to us, such as Professor Banach, there is this notion of the cauldron of the Coira as being something that at least metaphorically also exists within the human body. So there's a lot of cauldron stuff here. And there's a lot of notion of transferring food and of all that the food represents, including in this case, this remarkable mixture, this masala kind of porridge, which actually represents the Dagda himself very well. Because remember, if the Dagda is the good god because he can do everything, well, then he should be able to eat everything. Or what he eats should also have this omnibus quality to it. So anyway, the cauldrons figure very much in this episode of the Mag Tuired. Also looming large here is the threat of satire. And as Professor Kim McCone has written about, satire is a very important theme in the Mag Tuired. There are two instances of satire, or at least of the threat of satire, that he focuses on. There is one that has to do with a kaintja, with a satirist called Crithen Vale, who is said to have a mouth that comes out of his chest. And he is threatening the Dagda, small world, so it's a story involving the Dagda again. He is threatening the Dagda with satire unless the Dagda gives him the best food that he is receiving. And this is a problem that the Dagda has to find some kind of a solution to. The other instance where satire comes up in the Mag Tuired has to do with another poet, and this one is in fact more of a high-class poet. It's more of an Olav or a File, who comes to the king of the Tuatha De Danann, who really has no business being the king of the Tuatha De Danann because he's really Fomorian. The poet is ill ill-received and does not receive food. And so he composes what the text says is the first satire ever composed in Ireland. Notice here that, again, there's this connection between food and one's capacity to eat food, or the incapacity of any food to be eaten, and satire. And I think this is also something worth exploring further, is the way that to what extent is satire a function of food? To what extent is food itself perhaps even part of the function of or dependent upon the presence of satire, if in fact you don't receive it? Which then brings us to this text. That again has to do with satire and has to do with the threat of satire in food. And this is the Aisling of Mac Conglinne, the Vision of Mac Conglinne, which is a text early first or early second millennium AD, perhaps, as edited by Kenneth Jackson. This is a story too complicated to give a summary of, but I think we all probably are to some extent familiar with it. Anyway, Mac Conglinne is a starving student who has aspirations to become a file, and he goes down to Cork. And how ironic that in fact tonight there is a dias event taking place in Cork, and here I'm making a reference to a text which is very invidiously focused on Cork. So Mac Conglinne goes down to Cork, and there he is mistreated and not given sufficient food at all by the monks of Cork. And so there is definitely the threat of satire there. But what he really ends up doing is actually dealing with the king of Munster, Capel Mafingwine, who has a demon inside of him, which is eating up the food of all the people in his kingdom, as well as his own. So in some ways, eating up his own reputation as well. Mac Conglinne sets out to, in effect, cure Cathal of this possession. And the way he does it is he tells the story of a vision that he had. And in this vision, which is an extended part of the text, he talks about how he himself has a problem with food and that he just can't get enough. So he goes off on this voyage across a sea of milk to find a Faithliag, a prophetic leech, who is the only person who can perhaps cure him. And the Faithliag does indeed come up with a prescription for Mac Conglinne, which involves lots of eating, which then presumably will make him finally give up on his desire to keep eating. But then he says something at the end, and this is very much at the end of Mac Conglinne's account of his vision, and it also presents a very sudden shift in the story back to the present, where Mac Conglinne is basically torturing the king in order to lure the demon out by holding pieces of cooked meat in front of his mouth. But it's a passage which, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, no one has commented on, but it's an amazing punchline for the vision, and certainly gives us food for thought, though the thought is actually not necessarily very appetizing. So the Faithliag says he can cure Mac Conglinne of whatever illness he has, except for one, and it's one that you really don't want to be cured of, because it is the sickness of sages and of noblemen, and it is a sickness which is as valuable as sustained health. And what is it? It is buar. And buar is not exactly a common word. It is perhaps different from a word buar, meaning cattle. And it is glossed in one of the early modern Irish glossaries as meaning buinach, or meaning flux, or diarrhea. So the one disease you want to have, the one illness you want to have, is diarrhea, which I suppose you would want to have if you are Mac Conglinne. In fact, the Dathó has a kind of induced diarrhea in the follow-up to that episode I shared with you earlier, where in fact he does defecate all over the place, but that's in part because he's being beaten by a woman who wants to have sex with him. But here too, in the Vision of Mac Conglinne, we have this fascinating climax and a sudden break-off with a mention of what seems to be the dispersal of food, the getting rid of perhaps too much food that one has eaten. And given how Mac Conglinne is such a talker, and given how the text of the Vision of Mac Conglinne itself is such a virtuosic instance of lots of talk and lots of fancy vocabulary and lots of remarkable terminology having to do with food, given all that, I'm wondering whether the diarrhea here is also a reference to logorrhea and to just there being too many words, and then in some ways you have to you probably have to cut back on this text, just as you have to cut back on all the foods that Mac Conglinne will have to eat in order to be cured. So, given the collocation of science and fantasy and the designation of this presentation, the Vision of Mac Conglinne is an appropriate text with which to conclude. Since on the one hand, it tells what is easily the most fantastic and wildly imaginative story about eating that has survived from medieval Ireland. And yet, on the other hand, as Lucas and other scholars have observed, it provides us with more data about Irish food and foodways in earlier times than pretty much any other extant source. Also, reflecting as well as refracting the history of the island, the vision dwells on the reality of the occasional unreliability of the food supply and the genuine prospect of starvation, as well as on the very understandable wish fulfillment of food and drink available in superfluity. To state the obvious, we need to eat, and so food is of compelling interest per se. But additionally, food, as I hope I have shown in what I've shared with you tonight, is good to think with. And again, it is no coincidence that this cornucopic text, the Vision of Mac Conglinne, presents a veritable banquet of a critique of some of the key aspects of medieval Irish literature, culture, and religion. In sum, it is always worthwhile noticing when food is mentioned in our medieval texts. It is not just, if I may be allowed to confuse the senses, background noise, but valuable ethnographic evidence, as well as, in many cases, creative and insightful instances of something that we all, at some time or other in our lives, like to do, namely play with our food. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshi, for a veritable cook's tour through some extraordinary episodes and texts that most of us, or some of us, are quite familiar with, but hadn't really thought of in this particular way. St. Martin is a miller. Where does that come from?
Yes. Patricia, any thoughts? No, the tradition about St. Martin as a miller.
Yes, I would just like to mention in relation, in relation to St. Martin, that there was a more recent publication, 2016, by Billy McGlynn, a former student, PhD thesis, which was published by the Folklore Fellows, called Blood Right, the Feast of St. Martin in Ireland. But he does a comparative study throughout Europe, and food.
Thank you.
And the spilling of blood features very prominently in it, and the type of animals, etc., and how the food was used, and it's important in Ireland. And also in relation to the Feast of St. Martin, the food and the provision of the slaughtering of pigs and so on was very often carried out in November as well. And I think he's made some sort of link there as well to the Feast of St. Martin.
Thank you for that reference.
I'll give it to you.
Mill wheels are not supposed to be turned, right?
No,
on
that,
the eve,
that's
yeah.
something else on the Feast of Saint Martin, and that was very common. For example, in South Clare, you had the mills in Kilrush, Glens, and in no way were they mill on Saint Stephen's on Saint Martin's Day. So, or at least people would not bring anything to the mills for milling at that time, you know.
Yes, yes.
And it was a time of year as well when people did bring stuff for milling to it. So it was very important. But it is a certain sort of distribution as well around the southwest and South Clare and so on, and linked up to holy wells and as well. So it's quite rich in particular areas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? Or plenty of time for questions if people would like to raise anything.
As you mentioned at the beginning, I agree totally with you. The consumption of meat must have been much more extensive than Lucas et al. Had recorded. But that doesn't worry me too much at all, really, because it obviously was much greater, right? But what gives me an awful lot of concern, and I've been looking at this now ridiculously deeply, you know, and other words, I'm getting older. I've been looking at this. It's the consumption of fish that gives me the concern. At that stage, Ireland abounded with fish, and yet in the Ashling, there's only a tiny mention of, and to the best of my recollection, Lucas hardly mentions it at all, which is quite surprising, I think. And I think it's the question of the eating of fish is the biggest unsolved problem in regard to what foods were consumed in Ireland from these times and through the medieval period. I like your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that very helpful information.
Michelle will confirm, that, I mean, part of the forbidden thing to do on St. Martin's Day is fishing as well. So their fish consumption, was important. I'm saying that on St. Martin's Day, you weren't supposed to fish. And in fact, you have, several stories about people who were punished, for fishing on St. Martin's Day. So that would imply that fish consumption, did exist. And in the same way that you weren't allowed, to produce flour by using the mill, you were also forbidden, to bring back fish on that day.
Thank you.
I suppose the prohibition on eating meat on feast days and the requirement to eat fish does suggest that fish was a much lower status product.
Yeah.
I don't know if you
talked
about that.
That would be something very useful to look at in the modern period, because of course now I think you find fish on menus of many, many restaurants in Ireland. Was that the case, say, 100 years ago? And to what extent has that changed, or is there some innate prejudice against eating fish, perhaps?
Yeah.
Except perhaps for salmon. But
no, there's a scale of values. Yeah, fish were the lowest was lobster. Sorry, the lowest were shellfish.
Right.
Then lobster.
Right.
And then fish. I remember the story that D.A. Vinci told me of his first visit to West Kerry, Communal, in the 1920s. And he stayed with a local woman who put food on the table. For him, it was mackerel, and for the children, it was lobster. And he made some comment about how he had been in Paris before this. And he made some comment about how he wouldn't mind some lobster. And the response was, "Ni bia carte in that's not proper food for a gentleman like you." That was the whole, it was all connected with the amount of labor that you put into and the amount of interest and the amount of land and equipment you needed to so shellfish which we gathered from the shore were the least valued, such as oysters and mussels and things like that, which are highly valued now.
And there is the folk tale about Finn being caught by the giant from across the sea, eating shellfish.
Yeah.
And so he denies that he's Finn,
Yeah.
because he's so embarrassed.
I mean, it's stressed in the law tracts as well in Creath Goblach, the food render to the Lord. Great emphasis is laid on the fact that the food should be processed, so that the grain should be processed into malt, barley should be processed into malt. You don't give the Lord barley, you give the Lord barley that has been processed into malt, etc. You know, the food has to be processed, the wheat has to be dried, and so on.
Food, and it was way down in the social scale, right almost until very, very recent times. And because it was free, and because it was assumed that you didn't have any other means of actually producing food. So here you have the dichotomy or the contrast between land and no land. And people who had land, and perhaps very little of it, literally looked down on those near the shore who had no land, and who actually had to have canoes or traw, or to fish, or corrigane, or something like that. So it is a question again of land and no land, and of looking down on people who did have it. It was a situation that prevailed until very, very recent times, until food became, fish became part of a very healthy diet. And particularly in the Scandinavian situation, where shellfish became part of a healthy diet. I mean, there are stories of farmers from the very north of Scandinavia, of Norway, who during very, very bad times would not eat certain types of fish. It was called non-food, because they actually fed it to animals during the shortage of hay and so on, food for those. So it was associated with animal fodder, even though it was perfectly good to eat, and they would not eat it themselves. So what is food and what is non-food? And how, in fact, the most wonderful thing, I suppose, is in modern times, how that has changed. And it's linked very much to health, I think, as well, the health situation.
I told that story about my pitching to a friend of mine from Holland, and a friend of mine from Holland, and who holds a university position. I think you might all know who he is, but anyway. And he said, "Oh yes, my father was a farmer, and he'd never eat fish." That's not unique to Ireland.
And Maureen.
No, I just wanted to add another story from West Kerry to that. I remember being, as a student, being down in Dunhivon, this house that the university had, and I was there as a student, but there were people staying in it. Sean Lucy, who was the head of dairy science, and Sean O'Thwilma, and they actually cooked lobster, and they were really enjoying this wonderful meal of lobster. And the Banatee in Dunhivon was complaining the next day in Ballinarterig. She said, "Tá bla na bochtanachta an dig." You can smell the poverty from the house because they were cooking the lobster. But I was just thinking as well, I was thinking of the use of weirs, and the early Irish law references to the use of weirs on rivers, and the fact that you couldn't put a weir the whole way across a river, for instance, because that would take all the supply of fish. So if I remember rightly, you could be a single person was entitled to only 1/6 of the extent of the river. Certainly there are references to 1/6 and 1/3, and yet monasteries, of course, had weirs on rivers. So maybe there's a difference between, a clear difference between fish from the shore and fish from the rivers, right, and all the work you've done on salmon, the importance of salmon, for instance. Is it, it's river caught salmon we're talking about? Is it?
Fishing required fishing nets or rods and a boat, perhaps there was no, so even in Binchi was given the fish, right, and the children were given the lobster, which meant that the fish were valued more than the lobster. The lobster, you just pick them up from the lobster pots, whereas the fish, you have to go out in the boat and catch them, more effort involved in it, which is higher valued. So the same would then apply to weirs and so on. You don't just pick them up as you do with shellfish.
If I may ask two questions about which I would love to have feedback. I mean, one takes us back to fish here. The passage in Toinbal Feuch where there's the salmon, which had swallowed the ring, but Feuch has the salmon, and he tells Finnever to cook it and then present it to Alil, and then Feuch tells his lie about how the ring got there, or how the ring got away from Finnever. But we're told about that salmon, which is presented to Alil, that it was under honey. And I mentioned this to my class just the other day, and I said, ugh, can you just imagine that? But in fact, many of them said, no, that actually sounds like something very tasty, and it might give a nice glaze to the salmon. Do you ever serve salmon with honey on it?
Yes, and Robert said the sauce. Anyway, sauce, sugar and mustard. And of course, Robert laughs, it's seasoned with salt and sugar, and sometimes alcohol.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And my second question has to do with pigs. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Lucas's sense that, oh, they were eating primarily pork makes sense is because, yes, cows are a continuing supply, of course, except for bulls and oxen and for sick cows. But cows are a perpetual source of dairy products, which were still in some ways the essential part of the diet. Sheep provide wool. So once again, sheep are not to be slaughtered except perhaps for culling purposes if there's a sick sheep or whatever. But what good is a pig in the rural setting? I know they're very smart. I know they defecate as much as humans do. So they provide fertilizer, I guess. But would there be any reason to hold back from slaughtering a pig? Yeah, thank you. Just something for us to think about, because I would imagine that pigs are basically being raised in order to be consumed, versus cattle versus sheep, who are good for other, perhaps even more important purposes.
Sorry, well, pigs ever used at that time from monetary exchange the way they were for them.
For what exchange? Oh, okay, but were they fungible meat in effect that you could, fresh meat, as opposed to the roadkill that Dathó's pig was actually. But yeah, it's just something that I do wonder about, and something to ponder. And if anyone has any further thoughts about that, please do let me know.
Quick response to why they kill pigs rather than cows, right? There's a whole lot of reasons, really. We're coming to the very practical farming reason. On a small farm, they could readily kill a pig. They couldn't so easily manage a big beast like a cow. And according to Petty, that's one of the reasons that they didn't kill cows on farms, because they were too difficult to manage. The thing you mentioned back there about the salmon in Scandinavia, rabbits. I read something interesting about that there, which I hope I can remember. It's the translation of the name apparently is salmon. So it is a very funny translation. And then a little interesting story of fish consumption coming up to recent times. I spend a lot of time in the Gala Peninsula over the last 100 years. And the interesting thing is that despite the fact that they were catching plenty of salmon in the 50s and 60s, they used it mainly for heating pots. Eat salmon until about the 1970s. And it was a very intense fishing area down in West Cork, right? And no one approved of the eating the salmon. And if you went into the pub and said, I had a feed of salmon, it was very bad. You know, really, we shouldn't eat it.
Rabat action means very.
Maureen, yes.
Could I raise a question about the diarrhea? Thank you. Would you consider that it should be taken seriously as a reference to the diet eaten by the gentleman? You know, as you translated it, you know, it's the disease of sages and noblemen. So, you know, a very high meat, high dairy diet would have the opposite effect on you, wouldn't it? Would it not lead to chronic constipation? I don't know if there are medical people here who could answer that.
Well, of course, thank you. There is the desire for the king to expel this demon. So there is some expulsion being desired here. So maybe it's just reference to it, but from the other side. But what amuses me most of all about this is that I've seen no allusion to this in any of the modest-sized literature on this wonderful text. Perhaps.
Well, you're the first indelicate person to bring it up.
It would be, yes, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Any further thoughts, questions, or comments? Are we going to leave it with the diarrhea? It looks like we are. In that case, can I thank Professor Nagy for a wonderful lecture? Can I thank you also for coming all this way to give the lecture?
My pleasure.
All the way from, was it from California or from?
No, it was from Boston.
From Boston.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in any case, we thank you very much indeed, and we hope you found it as useful as we have.
Thank you very much. Thank you.